Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we cut through the noise to bring you the most critical insights from the sources you've shared. Today, we're asking a really foundational question. What if everything you thought you knew about the world, from your daily job to your deepest beliefs, is being fundamentally reshaped by forces you barely understand? We're talking about challenges so immense they could actually redefine what it means to be human. It's a pretty intense thought and frankly a bit disorienting.
It really is. And that disorientation, that's exactly where Yuval Noah Harari's 21 Lessons for the 21st Century picks up. After exploring our past in Sapiens and our potential future in Homo Deus, Harari now zeroes in on our chaotic present. He urges us basically to maintain focus amidst what he calls constant and disorienting change. And that's precisely our mission with this deep dive, to extract the most urgent, actionable insights from his work, helping you cut through what he calls the deluge of irrelevant information.
So our goal today is clarity. Yeah. We want to understand what Harari sees as the truly urgent issues of our time, from technological disruption and political fragmentation right through to the very meaning of life itself. The central question we're grappling with, the one that kind of threads through all his lessons, is are we still capable of truly understanding the world we've created? And maybe even more importantly, what can we as individuals actually do about it? Let's unpack this monumental challenge.
Well, Harari starts by challenging a core belief many of us grew up with. This idea that liberalism, democracy, human rights, free market capitalism, had definitively won the great ideological battles. For decades, especially after the fall of communism, it really felt like the end of history was upon us, like this settled political destiny for humanity.
I remember that feeling, yeah. That sense of an undeniable march towards progress and freedom. But Harari argues this triumph was, well, actually an illusion, and that the liberal story is now, as he puts it, in a jam. What specific events or trends, in his view, really expose this illusion most starkly?
He really points to the 2008 global financial crisis as a critical turning point. That's when the cracks became undeniable, he suggests. Since then, we've seen a surprising return of physical and digital walls and firewalls, a mounting resistance to immigration and free trade in many parts of the world. We're also witnessing democratic governments actively undermining the press and the judiciary alongside the rise of what he calls illiberal democracies.
Yeah.
And perhaps most tellingly, few today would confidently declare, as they might have, say, 30 years ago, that the Chinese Communist Party is on the wrong side of history. That confidence has evaporated.
When I read about technology essentially outpacing our political systems, that's where I really sat up and took notice. Harari highlights that our liberal political systems, designed for the industrial era, are now struggling immensely with the lightning-fast advancements in, well, infotech and biotech. What's his most striking example of this tech-politics disconnect?
Well, he argues that the internet revolution, for instance, was driven primarily by engineers and entrepreneurs, not by voters or politicians.
Right.
Think about it. Did you ever vote on how the internet should evolve? Or how social media algorithms should work? Probably not. And even more critically, he notes that monumental issues like the potential impact of AI on jobs, arguably the biggest challenge ahead, were barely even a footnote in the 2016 U.S. presidential race. The political system just wasn't grappling with it.
Right. So if the system can't even grasp the implications of these massive technological shifts, what does that mean for the average person? Harari suggests that in stark contrast to the heroic worker propaganda of the 20th century, ordinary people today feel increasingly, well, irrelevant.
Yeah.
You hear terms like globalization, blockchain, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence thrown around, and the common person might suspect none of these words are actually about them.
Exactly. And this fear of irrelevance is a profound shift from past centuries. In the 20th century, the masses often revolted against exploitation, right? Demanding recognition for their vital role in the economy. Now, Harari posits, the fear isn't exploitation. It's simply being unneeded, surplus to requirements. So, populist revolts like Brexit or the rise of Trump might represent a desperate attempt to use remaining political power before it's too late, before they become truly irrelevant. But he warns it's likely a losing battle because struggling against irrelevance is fundamentally harder, maybe impossible, compared to fighting exploitation.
That's a sobering thought, a really sobering thought. But is Harari perhaps too pessimistic about liberalism's adaptability, especially given the speed of tech change? He does mention that liberalism has survived past crises, almost like a liberal phoenix, right?
He does, and that's a crucial nuance, yeah. He reminds us that liberalism endured the First World War, the rise of fascism, the Cold War, adapting each time. It bent, but didn't break. He even points to China's maybe surprisingly liberal approach to international trade and cooperation, despite its tight domestic political control, as evidence of liberalism's continued influence, or at least its utility. And while Russia's military resurgence is notable, he views its underlying ideology as essentially bankrupt. No grand vision to offer the world. So he implies this crisis might be less severe than past ones. But the warning is clear. Without a viable alternative global story, people might retreat into divisive local nationalist and religious tales. And he absolutely insists that any new global story must grapple with the realities of AI, big data, and bioengineering. You just can't ignore them.
Building on that, let's turn our attention to one of the most immediate and frankly profound technological challenges, the future of work in the age of AI. Harari opens this discussion with a truly chilling thought, something many parents might ponder. When you grow up, you might not have a job. This isn't just about computers getting faster, is it? It's something deeper.
No, it's far deeper. The core threat, as he sees it, comes from a deeper scientific understanding of human biology and the social sciences. As we unravel the biochemical mechanisms underpinning our emotions, desires, and choices, AI gains the ability to, essentially, hack humans, to understand us so intimately that it can predict and even replace tasks we thought were uniquely human, things we thought required intuition.
And what we often perceive as human intuition is a prime example of this. Harari explains that the intuition of a good driver, or a skilled banker, or an experienced lawyer, it isn't some mystical quality. Instead, it's the brain's incredibly rapid calculation of probabilities and recognition of recurring biochemical patterns. It's sophisticated pattern matching, really.
Exactly. And AI, with its vast data processing power and lack of human errors like distraction or fatigue or bias, will soon be able to perform these pattern recognitions far more accurately and reliably. That's the claim.
Okay, but the potential benefits are huge too, right? He talks about that.
Oh, absolutely. The potential benefits are truly immense. Harari highlights how AI doctors could provide far better and cheaper healthcare for billions globally. Think about getting expert diagnosis via smartphone, even in underdeveloped countries. Similarly, self-driving vehicles are projected to reduce traffic fatalities by a staggering 90%. That could potentially save 1 million people every year. It's hard to argue against that potential upside.
It really is, 1 million lives. But there's a significant downside Harari warns us about, the rise of a useless class. That's a harsh term. He draws this stark comparison to 19th century horses, which were largely pushed out of the job market by cars and tractors. The job market, he argues, won't simply find a new equilibrium like it has in past technological shifts.
No, he sees it differently this time.
Instead, he predicts a cascade of ever bigger disruptions, making the very idea of a profession for life seem antediluvian, like unbelievably old-fashioned by 2050. I mean, just imagine retraining multiple times in your life, maybe learning incredibly complex new skills, only for each one to be automated away a decade later. That sounds exhausting and demoralizing.
It does. It really does. So what are the potential solutions? If this is coming, what do we do? Harari explores universal basic income, or UBI, as a prominent model. The basic idea is that governments would tax the tech giants and corporations controlling the algorithms and robots,
Yeah.
the ones reaping the massive profits, and then provide every person with a stipend covering their basic needs, food, shelter, etc. He suggests this would not only cushion the poor against job loss, but also protect the wealthy from, well, populist backlash, keep social stability. Another related idea is to actually redefine what constitutes a job, recognizing invaluable, often unpaid activities like childcare or community organizing as legitimate paid work, though that would also likely necessitate government funding, something similar to UBI in practice.
But UBI isn't without its challenges, is it? I remember reading Harari's concern about the national versus universal aspect. That seems critical.
Precisely. That's a huge potential pitfall. Current UBI experiments, the ones we've seen in places like Finland or Ontario, they're strictly national, within one country's borders. But what happens if AI and 3D printers replace cheap labor globally? Think textile workers in Dhaka or call centers in Bangalore. Then revenues will concentrate in just a few tech hubs, like Silicon Valley or Shenzhen. This could potentially collapse the economies of developing countries that rely on that cheap labor export. He talks about the bridge that cheap labor once provided across the global economic divide. Well, that bridge is shaking, and those who haven't crossed it might be permanently stuck on the wrong side.
Wow, that's a stark image.
And then there's the question of what is basic. Harari points out that defining basic human needs is culturally subjective, and it constantly evolves. Is internet access basic now? Healthcare, education. And even if basic needs are met, he argues, fierce social competition will simply shift to non-basic luxuries, status symbols, unique experiences, whatever. This could lead to what he calls unbridgeable inequality between the rich tech managers and the UBI-dependent poor. Not just unequal, but fundamentally different kinds of existence. And that could foster deep dissatisfaction because, as he reminds us, human happiness depends less on objective conditions and more on our own expectations. If your neighbors are living bioengineered super lives, your UBI might feel pretty grim.
So UBI might improve objective conditions like poverty, but it still might fail to prevent social discontent or envy. That's tricky. For a model of a potential post-work world, Harari offers a surprising example. You mentioned Israel's ultra-Orthodox Jewish men.
Yeah, it's a provocative example he uses. In some ultra-Orthodox communities in Israel, roughly half the men don't participate in the formal workforce. They focus instead on religious study and community life. They're supported financially by their working wives and often by government subsidies. Harari provocatively suggests that as AI pushes more and more humans out of the traditional job market, maybe the quest for meaning and for community might eclipse the quest for a job for everyone. It's a fundamentally different way of thinking about human purpose, isn't it? Moving beyond economics as the primary driver of value.
It really is. Okay, let's connect this to an even bigger shift Harari discusses, the fundamental change in authority, moving from humans to algorithms. This isn't just about jobs anymore, it's about our very concept of individual freedom, of choice. He suggests that the coming technological revolution could establish the authority of big data algorithms, effectively undermining the very idea of individual freedom. How does he argue that?
Well, this is where Harari directly challenges our common understanding of free will. He leans heavily on scientific insights, particularly from neuroscience and biology. These suggest that our feelings aren't some unique spiritual quality, but rather complex biochemical mechanisms that evolved for survival and reproduction. They're algorithms honed by evolution. Our sense of free will, he argues, is largely an illusion because these rapid calculations, these biochemical processes, happen far below our conscious awareness. So it's less I freely decided to want that ice cream, and more like my brain's complex system processed 1,000 inputs, blood sugar, social cues, advertising I saw, and then presented me with the conscious desire for ice cream. It feels like a choice. But Harari, drawing on certain scientific interpretations, says the decision-making process largely happened beneath the surface, driven by biochemical algorithms.
Okay, and this leads to a truly unsettling prospect, the hacking of human decisions. You mentioned hacking humans earlier. Historically, no external system could understand our inner workings better than ourselves. Our feelings were private, opaque.
Right. But now, with biotech sensors monitoring our bodies and infotech processing the data, big data algorithms will soon be able to monitor and understand our feelings much better than I can. That's the prediction. This potentially makes our own human feelings less reliable as guides. We might be experiencing something, but the algorithm knows better what's really going on biochemically. This could force us, maybe even rationally, to trust algorithms over our own instincts. He uses the analogy of a pilot experiencing vertigo. You feel like you're flying straight, but the instruments say you're banking dangerously. You have to trust the instruments to survive.
So we might need to trust the algorithm's assessment of our own state, even if it contradicts our feelings.
Potentially, yes. And this, of course, opens the door to precision-guided manipulation, advertisement, and propaganda on an unprecedented scale. If an external system knows your emotional triggers better than you do, it can pull your strings very effectively.
That's deeply concerning.
Yeah.
But he also suggests algorithms might outperform us in ethics. That seems counterintuitive.
Yeah. It does, doesn't it? But his argument is that algorithms, unlike humans, aren't swayed by emotions, gut instincts, fatigue, or personal biases. Things that have historically led humans to less than ideal behavior, to put it mildly. He provocatively imagines if philosophers like Kant, Mill, and Rawls could write code, if you could embed their ethical frameworks into an algorithm. Then, he suggests, every self-driving car could be driven by Michael Schumacher and Immanuel Kant rolled into one, possessing superhuman driving skill and impeccable ethical judgment. This could potentially reduce human-caused accidents by that staggering 90% figure. It's a powerful thought, a more rational, less emotionally volatile ethical agent.
But this brings us to the truly chilling prospect he raises, digital dictatorships. Harari explains that the fear isn't necessarily that robots will rebel, like in the movies. It's almost the opposite, that they will probably always obey their masters. That's the real danger.
Exactly. He describes scenarios like using emotionless killer robots in warfare. On one hand, they might adhere to military codes and the laws of war better than human soldiers who can panic or act out of rage or fear. They might prevent atrocities like my lie. However, if the code itself, the orders given by the human masters, is ruthless and cruel, like the policies authorizing the Srebrenica massacre, then the robots will execute those orders relentlessly without hesitation or remorse. The efficiency becomes terrifying.
And this fundamentally shifts the balance of power between political systems, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. In the 20th century, democracies often outperformed dictatorships, partly because they were better at processing information in a diffused way. Centralized systems got bogged down. But AI, Harari argues, swings the pendulum back. It makes it possible to process enormous amounts of information centrally, with incredible efficiency. Imagine an authoritarian government collecting all its citizens' biometric data, DNA, medical records, online activity. AI can analyze that vast data set in ways no KGB or Stasi could have dreamed of. This means the main handicap of 20th century dictatorships, their inefficiency in processing information, might become their decisive advantage in the 21st century.
So this wouldn't be a simple return to Hitler or Stalin, but a new, potentially more stable, more efficient, and perhaps harder to resist form of digital dictatorship. Harari warns against preparing to refight the battles of the 1930s, because the attack, the control, will come from a totally different direction.
Yes, and the most banal apocalypse he describes isn't a dramatic robot rebellion, it's much more insidious. It's sophisticated AI empowering the natural stupidity of humans. An AI that learns to manipulate our emotional buttons better than our own mothers, better than advertisers ever could, selling us not just cars, but politicians, ideologies, exploiting our deepest fears, hatreds, and cravings with pinpoint accuracy. Being controlled not by overt force, but by our own manipulated emotions, clicking away on our devices through a banal apocalypse by clicking. That's a truly terrifying vision of subtle, personalized manipulation.
Let's delve further into the implications of this digital future, particularly the concentration of power through data ownership. This seems absolutely central. Harari posits that in the 21st century, data will eclipse both land and machinery as the most important asset, and controlling its flow will be the new core political struggle. This isn't just an economic shift, it's a societal one with profound consequences he outlines.
The most severe consequence he envisions is the very real risk of speciation. That's a shocking idea. If data and the power that comes with it concentrates in too few hands, humankind could literally split into different species. Imagine the rich, enhanced by bioengineering and AI algorithms they own or have exclusive access to, becoming more talented, more creative, and more intelligent than the slum dwellers who are left behind, data poor and unenhanced. This could create an unbridgeable biological gap, not just in wealth or opportunity, but in fundamental human capabilities. It makes the traditional fight against economic inequality seem almost quaint by comparison.
That's a truly chilling prospect. Speciation. Wow. And it could lead to a frightening vision of deglobalization, or at least a fractured globalization. Harari suggests ruling oligarchies, perhaps drawn from different countries but united by their access to tech and data, could merge and form a self-proclaimed global civilization.
Right, a kind of techno-elite.
And they might build virtual or even physical walls and moats to separate themselves from the hordes of barbarians in countries that have become economically and strategically irrelevant.
Unlike the industrial age, which needed cheap labor from all over the globe, a post-industrial civilization relying on AI and bioengineering could be far more self-contained, more insulated. Entire countries, entire continents could simply become obsolete to this new elite, left outside the walls.
And this vulnerability, this potential irrelevance, brings us back to what Harari calls the knowledge illusion. We talked about individual ignorance.
Exactly. Individually, we know embarrassingly little about the world. We rely heavily on the expertise of others for almost everything, like not really knowing how a zipper works despite using it daily. We outsource our understanding. Well, this groupthink, this reliance on collective knowledge, worked evolutionarily in the modern age. It's amplified and potentially distorted by technology. We get stuck in echo chambers, self-confirming news feeds. Our beliefs are constantly reinforced, rarely challenged, even on complex issues where our views might be shaped more by tribal affiliation than deep understanding, like how political leanings often dictate views on environmental regulation, regardless of the scientific details. This collective ignorance, amplified by algorithms designed to keep us engaged rather than informed, makes us incredibly vulnerable to manipulation by those who do control the data and the narratives.
So, how do we possibly prevent this stark future, this concentration of power, this potential speciation? Harari identifies regulating data ownership as the most important political question of our era. That's a strong claim.
It is. He laments that humans readily, almost casually, give away their most valuable asset, their personal data, in exchange for free email services and funny cat videos. He draws this analogy to indigenous tribes selling vast tracts of land for cheap trinkets for glass beads. We don't grasp the true value of what we're giving away. But regulating data is immensely difficult. Unlike land or machines, data is everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. It moves at the speed of light, can be copied infinitely, and doesn't respect national borders. How do you regulate that? He puts out a call, really, to lawyers, politicians, philosophers, and even poets. We need creative thinking from all fields to tackle this conundrum. Because without an answer, he warns, our current socio-political system could simply collapse under the strain.
Moving from that huge abstract challenge to a very concrete manifestation of it, Harari also looks at social media platforms, specifically Facebook. He discusses Mark Zuckerberg's 2017 manifesto, which ambitiously focused on building a global community. Zuckerberg acknowledged the disintegration of human communities as a core source of modern socio-political upheaval.
Yeah, Zuckerberg even envisioned Facebook AI actively strengthening our social fabric.
Harari recognizes the underlying problem Zuckerberg identified, right? The loss of intimate community.
He does. Harari agrees that the modern attempt to replace small, close-knit groups, villages, tribes, with the vast imagined communities of nations or political parties has largely failed to satisfy our deep-seated need for belonging. This has left many people feeling isolated and lonely, ironically, on an ever more connected planet.
But there's a fundamental difference between online and offline communities that Harari highlights. This seems key. While online spaces can certainly foster offline connections sometimes, he argues pretty strongly that physical communities have a depth that virtual communities cannot match.
Right. His example is vivid. Your online friends from California can chat with you and offer sympathy when you're sick in, say, London, but they can't actually bring you a bowl of soup or a cup of tea. Physical presence matters. He notes that modern technology, particularly our ubiquitous smartphones, often distances us from our bodies and our immediate physical surroundings. We become more interested in what is happening in cyberspace than in what is happening down the street.
And this creates a direct conflict with Facebook's business model, doesn't it?
Exactly. Harari points out that Facebook's model profits from capturing people's attention and selling it to advertisers. Maximizing engagement time, basically. This model is inherently structurally at odds with building genuine communities, which often requires sustained, sometimes difficult, selfless engagement, not just fragmented attention optimized for ad views. Corporations, he argues, are generally not ideal vehicles for driving deep social revolutions because ultimately they prioritize profit over the sacrifice genuine community building might require. He suggests Facebook and other online giants tend to view humans primarily as audiovisual animals, essentially a pair of eyes and ears connected to 10 fingers, a screen, and a credit card. This view neglects the profound importance of our physical bodies, our embodied existence, and the nature of intimate, limited human relationships. Remember Dunbar's number suggesting we can only maintain about 150 stable relationships. Online networks ignore that biological constraint. So, to truly unite humankind, Harari stresses, we must appreciate that humans have bodies and find ways to bridge the growing gap between our online and offline experiences. We need both.
Okay, let's pivot now to the political challenges Harari outlines, starting with his provocative take on the illusion of civilizational clashes. You hear it all the time. Pundits and politicians talking about clashes between, say, Western civilization and Islamic civilization or Chinese civilization, as if these are fixed, monolithic, unchanging entities destined to collide. But Harari really challenges this idea, arguing that human identities are far more fluid, far more malleable than we tend to assume.
Yet his core argument is that this whole clash of civilizations idea wrongly equates human groups with animal species. Species have fixed, genetically determined identities and social behaviors, largely unchanging over generations. Human groups are fundamentally different. We are not genetically determined in that way, and our cultures and political systems change incredibly rapidly. His example of the Germans is striking, organizing themselves into 6 very different political systems in less than a century, from the Kaiser's Empire to Bismarck, Weimar Republic, Nazi Germany, divided Germany, and then reunited democratic Germany. While maybe language or a love of bratwurst might endure through some of that, there's certainly no single unique German essence that remained unchanged through those upheavals. This fluidity, he argues, completely undermines the notion of rigid, ancient, clashing civilizations.
And this fluidity, he suggests, paradoxically leads to a surprising homogeneity in modern civilization. That seems counterintuitive at first. Harari uses the example of the modern Olympics. You have all these nations marching under different flags, but the very structure of the event illustrates an astonishing global agreement on political paradigms, rules, symbols, the idea of nation states itself.
Exactly. He contrasts this with trying to organize a hypothetical medieval Olympics. It would have been utterly impossible. You'd have kingdoms, duchies, caliphates, city-states, religious orders. There'd be no agreement on delegations, flags, anthems, or even common rules for competition. The diversity of political forms was immense. Today, we largely agree on the nation-state model.
That's a great point. What other examples does he use?
He also points to the humble American dollar bill. It's universally venerated across all political and religious divides, he notes. Even Islamic fundamentalists who decry Western culture or North Korean tyrants still value and use the dollar. That signifies a deep shared trust in global economic systems, regardless of ideology. And perhaps even more striking is the standardization of medicine. 1,000 years ago, you had vastly different, often totally ineffective medical practices across cultures based on humors, spirits, qi, whatever. Today, almost all societies, from Tokyo to Tehran to Toronto, converge on a single scientific understanding of the human body, disease, and treatment. This shared medical civilization has led to vastly improved life expectancy everywhere. These are powerful testaments to shared global practices and beliefs that run much deeper than the superficial clashes we often focus on.
So, for all our apparent differences, we actually share a surprising amount of common ground, especially in how we structure our world and understand reality. Harari then provocatively suggests that maybe civilizations are defined by internal disputes, that what we fight about actually defines us.
Right. To be European in 1618, he says, meant obsessing over the minute differences between Catholic and Protestant theology. That was a defining conflict. In 1940, being European was defined by the titanic struggle between democracy and fascism, embodied by figures like Churchill and Hitler. Today, he argues, Europeans and many others are defined by their arguments over immigration, the future of the EU, the role of capitalism versus social welfare. And these debates paradoxically make them increasingly similar to their Chinese and Indian trade partners, who are grappling with very similar modern dilemmas about globalization, inequality, and national identity. His point is, what we fight about often reveals our shared concerns and frameworks, and those battles are increasingly global in nature, not contained within hermetically sealed civilizations.
Building on that idea of shared global dilemmas, Harari next tackles nationalism. He acknowledges its benefits, but highlights its surprising inadequacy in the face of today's most pressing threats. While nationalism can provide security and prosperity, offering things like national healthcare systems, education, social welfare, he warns that benign patriotism, a healthy love for one's country, can easily morph into chauvinistic ultranationalism.
Yeah, that happens when a nation starts believing itself supreme, uniquely important, and its interests override everyone else's. This inevitably leads to conflict.
But the most profound insight here, I think, is that the biggest existential threats we face simply cannot be solved by nationalism acting alone.
Absolutely. He focuses on two key examples: the ecological challenge and technological disruption. These are inherently global problems that demand global cooperation. Take climate change, or even something like phosphorus pollution, he mentions. A farmer fertilizing a field in Iowa can inadvertently contribute to a dead zone killing fish in the Gulf of Mexico, hundreds of miles away. National borders are meaningless to ecosystems. Nations are not ecologically sovereign, he notes. He cites the poignant example of Kiribati, a low-lying island nation. It could reduce its own greenhouse gas emissions to absolute zero tomorrow, and would still be submerged by rising sea levels if other larger countries don't drastically cut their emissions. Kiribati's fate is global, not national.
Right. And technology. Similarly, with potentially transformative and risky technologies like AI and bioengineering, think about genetically engineering human embryos, for example. If one nation aggressively pursues such high-risk tech while others try to ban it, the cautious nations will inevitably feel immense pressure to follow suit. Just to avoid falling behind economically or militarily, it creates a dangerous race to the bottom. Okay. To avoid this, Harari argues, humankind will need some form of shared global identity and loyalty that can override narrow national interests when necessary. We need global rules for global technologies. So the core issue then is this fundamental mismatch. Harari states it bluntly. Nations are no longer the right framework for tackling the most important challenges of the age. We've created a global ecology, a global economy, and a global science, but we are still stuck with only national politics. This mismatch paralyzes us, prevents us from effectively countering our biggest problems.
Exactly. Which raises the obvious difficult question. If nations aren't the solution, what is? Is it a world government? Harari is skeptical about that. He calls a single global government a doubtful and unrealistic vision for the foreseeable future. Rather, he talks about globalizing politics. This means that political dynamics within countries and even within cities should give far more weight to global problems and interests. It's about shifting our priorities, our focus, recognizing our shared humanity and our shared fate on this planet, even while operating within existing political structures, thinking globally, acting locally and nationally, but with a global perspective.
Okay, now let's explore another traditional source of identity and meaning that people often turn to, especially when secular ideologies seem to fail: religion. After modern ideas like liberalism or communism haven't delivered a perfect future and nationalism seems inadequate, many people wonder, do religious traditions hold the answer to the 21st century's problems?
Harari's perspective here is quite pointed, maybe even critical. First, he argues that there's really no religious economics relevant to today's world. While ancient religious texts certainly contain economic ideas or principles, they were designed for agrarian or pre-industrial societies and are often completely outdated or incompatible with the complexities of modern global capitalism technology. He uses the example of Mahatma Gandhi's vision for an independent India, inspired by the ancient Vedas. Gandhi advocated for a decentralized, self-sufficient village-based economy. Harari argues this was simply incompatible with the realities of modern economics and ultimately faded into symbolism rather than practical policy. So while religions can adapt their interpretations to engage with modern debates, he gives the example of Pope Francis versus American evangelicals on climate change, both quoting the Bible to support opposing views. The real source of their difference will be in modern scientific theories and political movements, not in the Bible itself. Religion adapts, he suggests, but it doesn't necessarily lead in solving complex modern problems like climate change or AI. It often acts more as a veneer, as you said, over deeper contemporary forces.
So rather than providing unique solutions, religion often ends up reflecting existing secular debates. But he doesn't dismiss its power, right? He criticizes Marx for underestimating religion.
Exactly. While religion might be a veneer over economic structure sometimes, it's true, enduring power lies in manufacturing mass identities and enabling large-scale cooperation. That's a core theme from Sapiens, too. All mass identities, Harari contends, whether religious, national, or ideological, are ultimately based on fictional stories, not on scientific facts or even on economic necessities. We cooperate because we believe the same stories, and these religious myths, even if they seem trifling or irrational from an outsider's perspective, can create powerful bonds within a group, but also deep divisions between groups. They can become a matter of life and death, for example, in the starkly different approaches to LGBT rights in relatively secular Israel versus the Islamic Republic of Iran, both citing religious justifications.
And he points to a potentially darker aspect of monotheism specifically.
Yes, he does argue, somewhat controversially, that the rise of monotheism historically made many people far more intolerant than before. By insisting there is no God but our God, and he demands X, Y, and Z, it could fuel crusades, jihads, inquisitions, and the suppression of pagan traditions. He cites the example of the Roman Emperor Theodosius, who, after converting to Christianity, actively suppressed all other traditional Roman and Greek religions, even banning the centuries-old Olympic Games because of their pagan associations. Ultimately, Harari concludes that in the context of today's global challenges, traditional religions often make it even harder to transcend national differences and find a global solution. Why? Because they frequently end up serving nationalism, bolstering a particular nation's identity, and encouraging followers to prioritize their nation's interests, blessed by their God, above shared global concerns. In this sense, he argues, they become part of humanity's problem rather than its remedy when facing truly global threats like nuclear war or ecological collapse.
Moving from religion, let's tackle the very complex and often heated issue of immigration. Harari uses this as a key illustration of the fragmentation of societies in a global world. He frames the European Union's ongoing crisis, seeing the EU as a grand multicultural experiment, as teetering largely due to these challenges of integration and immigration.
Right, and he tries to structure the debate around what he calls a potential deal with three implicit clauses. Clause 1, The host country allows immigrants in. Clause 2. In return, the immigrants make an effort to assimilate. Clause 3. If they assimilate successfully, the host country eventually accepts them as full first-class citizens.
But this hypothetical deal immediately breaks down into contentious debates, doesn't it?
Yes, it fragments into at least two major debates. The first is about Clause 1, duty versus favor. Is letting immigrants in a duty or merely a favor? Anti-immigration voices argue host countries have no obligation to open their doors, except perhaps to genuine refugees fleeing persecution, and even then, limits are debated. It's our country, we decide. Pro-immigration voices argue that stopping immigration entirely is practically impossible in a globalized world, that migration has historical benefits, and that legalizing and managing it is better than driving it underground. Some also invoke moral or humanitarian arguments. Harari also points out that some countries want to have their cake and eat it. They benefit from cheap immigrant labor but refuse to grant legal status or paths to citizenship, potentially creating permanent hierarchical societies with an underclass like we see in some Gulf states. Okay, so that's the first debate. Andrew, what's the second? The second debate is about Clause 2, the extent of assimilation. How much should immigrants be expected to change? How far should they assimilate into the host culture? Must they adopt the host country's views on feminism or secularism? Must they abandon traditional dress or food or religious practices? Anti-immigration proponents tend to set the assimilation bar very high, demanding significant cultural conformity. Pro-immigration proponents usually set it lower, emphasizing multiculturalism and tolerance for diversity. This disagreement, Harari notes, goes to the core of immigrant tolerance, but also touches on the very definition of European or any host society's identity itself. What does it mean to be European or American or Canadian today?
And Harari makes a really key observation here about how the underlying justification has shifted. He talks about the move from racism to culturism. Can you unpack that?
Sure. He argues the battlefront has shifted. Traditional biological racism, the idea that certain races are inherently genetically inferior, is largely discredited by science and publicly unacceptable in most places. It's been replaced, he argues, by culturism. Culturism doesn't claim biological inferiority. Instead, it claims that problems arise from supposedly dysfunctional subcultures or incompatible cultural values. He points to remarks like President Trump's alleged comments about shithole countries or generalizations about Mexican immigrants bringing crime as examples of claims that are sociologically rather than biologically offensive. They attack the culture, not the genes. Skin color, Harari notes, unfortunately still matters immensely due to historical baggage and ingrained biases, but the justification for discrimination often shifts from biology to culture.
And this shift to culturism has complex implications, right? It's not necessarily more tolerant.
Not necessarily, no. On one hand, since culture is seen as more malleable than biology, culturists could theoretically be more tolerant. If you adopt our superior culture, you can join us. But in practice, Harari observes, this often leads to far stronger pressures on immigrants to assimilate completely and much harsher criticism and judgment if they are perceived as failing to do so. The demand becomes conformity. He also identifies two common flaws in many culturist claims. First, they often confuse local superiority with objective superiority. A cultural norm that works well in one context, like, say, direct confrontation versus indirect communication, isn't necessarily objectively better everywhere. Cultural diversity can actually be a strength. Second, culturist claims, even if statistically accurate for a group on average, are all too often used to prejudge individuals. It might be logical to prefer hiring a sociable employee, but it's illogical and unfair to prefer hiring a warmlander over a coldian, just because warmlanders are stereotyped as more sociable. Individuals constantly defy group stereotypes.
It's clearly a very difficult, complex path with no easy answers. Harari stresses that the debate isn't simple.
No, he explicitly says it's not a clear-cut battle between good and evil. There are legitimate concerns on all sides. He concludes this section by saying if Europe, as a major test case, can somehow find a middle path, one that allows it to remain open and tolerant, integrating strangers without destabilizing its own social fabric, it could offer a valuable model for the whole world. But if it fails, if the multicultural experiment collapses into conflict or segregation, it would suggest that perhaps liberalism, in its current form, isn't sufficient to resolve these deep cultural conflicts and unite humankind against the even bigger global threats we face. It's a crucial test case for our ability to adapt as a species.
As we move into the final part of our deep dive, Harari shifts perspective slightly. He moves from examining the huge external challenges, tech, politics, etc., to contemplating how we as individuals can navigate the uncertainty and anxiety they create. He offers paths that touch on both despair and hope. Let's start with his take on terrorism, where his core advice is remarkably simple, if hard to follow. Don't panic.
Yeah, his analysis of terrorism is really interesting because he frames it primarily as a form of psychological warfare, almost mind control.
Hmm.
Terrorists, statistically speaking, kill very few people. He gives figures, maybe 50 people a year in the entire EU, around 10 a year in the USA in recent years prior to the book's writing. Compare that to, say, traffic accidents, 1.25 million deaths globally per year, diabetes, 3.5 million, or air pollution, a staggering 7 million. Terrorism is a tiny statistical threat.
Tiny, yeah.
Yet, it terrifies billions and can destabilize entire nations, dominating headlines and political agendas. How? Harari argues the core strategy of terrorists, who are militarily very weak, is to provoke an overreaction from their powerful enemy. They plant a small bomb, hoping the state will respond with massive force. They aim to create a much more violent military and political storm than the terrorists themselves could ever create. They want the enemy's reaction to reshuffle the political cards in their favor by manipulating public fear and goading the state into actions that alienate populations or undermine its own values.
So the power isn't really in the bomb itself, but in our reaction to it. Our role is crucial then.
Absolutely crucial. Harari states it directly and powerfully. The success or failure of terrorism thus depends on us. If we allow our imagination to be captured by fear, if we give in to hysteria and demand disproportionate reactions from our governments, then terrorism succeeds. It achieves its aim of disruption and manipulation. If, however, we remain balanced, keep the threat in perspective, and free our imagination from the grip of fear, then terrorism fails. It remains a marginal nuisance. He points out the immense opportunity cost of the post-9/11 war on terror. Trillions of dollars in vast political energy were diverted to fighting terrorism. Resources that could have been spent tackling far greater threats like global warming, AIDS, global poverty, or improving relations with other major powers like Russia and China. This demonstrates, he argues, the critical importance of setting our priorities wisely based on rational assessment of threats, not on manipulated fear.
But what about future threats? Is he complacent?
No, not at all. It's important to differentiate. Harari explicitly warns that nuclear, cyber, or especially bioterrorism would be a far, far graver threat than conventional terrorism. An attack using engineered pathogens could kill millions and truly destabilize civilization. Such threats, he says, would require drastic reactions. But his crucial point is that we must be careful not to confuse these potential hypothetical future scenarios with the relatively limited capabilities of current terrorist groups. We need to avoid hysterical overreactions today and avoid persecuting dissident groups or minorities based on fears of what they might do with future technologies. Keep the current threat in perspective.
Okay, following on that theme of conflict, Harari then dives into war with a rather sobering subtitle: Never underestimate human stupidity. He acknowledges that the last few decades were, statistically, humanity's most peaceful era ever. Violence accounted for only about 1% of global deaths recently, compared to maybe 15% in early agricultural societies. A huge improvement.
Huge. But he wrote this before some recent escalations, and even then, he noted that post-2008, the global situation seemed to be deteriorating. Warmongering rhetoric was becoming fashionable again. War is back in vogue, he worried.
And he makes this really interesting observation that major powers seem to have actually lost the art of winning wars in the traditional sense. What does he mean by that?
Well, his argument is that in the past, say Roman times or even up to the early 20th century, economic assets were primarily material. Land, gold mines, wheat fields, slaves, factories, these could be conquered profitably through military force. War could pay. Today, however, the main economic assets are increasingly knowledge-based. Technical and institutional knowledge, software, brands, complex supply chains, skilled populations. And you simply cannot conquer knowledge effectively through war. Bombing Silicon Valley doesn't transfer its knowledge to you, it just destroys it. Occupying a country doesn't give you automatic access to its citizens' ingenuity or complex social systems. Furthermore, modern high-tech weapons like nuclear weapons and potentially cyber warfare are what he calls high-damage, low-profit technologies. They're great for destruction, but you can't really build stable, profitable empires with them in the way the Romans or British could, with legions or gunboats.
So conquest is less profitable, maybe even counterproductive. Does he see current powers acting on this logic?
He suggests their ambition seems somewhat limited compared to past empires. China's ascent, he observed, was primarily economic, not based on large-scale military conquest. Iran uses indirect influence, proxies. Even Russia, though militarily active in neighboring regions like Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria, is far weaker than the old Soviet Union, lacks a compelling universal ideology to export, and seems unlikely, in his view at the time, to embark on a global conquest like Hitler or Stalin attempted. The calculus of war has changed.
But, and this is a big but, he brings in human stupidity.
Yes, this is one of Harari's most unsettling and recurring points across his books. Human stupidity is one of the most important forces in history. We often discount it. We like to assume leaders, especially powerful ones, are always rational actors making calculated decisions. But Harari argues the world is far too complex for any single human mind or even group of minds to fully grasp. Our rationality is bounded. Consequently, even intelligent and well-intentioned leaders frequently end up doing very stupid things with disastrous consequences. Think of the calculations leading up to World War I, for example. And crucially, he warns, there's no God and no law of nature protects us from human stupidity. It's always a possibility. Rationality is not guaranteed.
So what's the remedy? If stupidity is such a potent force, how do we counter it, especially the grandiosity that often accompanies power?
Harari suggests a simple yet profound remedy, a dose of humility, both personal and collective humility. He argues that national, religious, and cultural tensions are greatly exacerbated by this grandiose feeling that my nation, my religion, and my culture are the most important in the world. That our story is the central story of humanity. This feeling leads us to prioritize our interests above all others, to demonize dissent, and to blunder into conflicts based on inflated self-importance and misjudgments of others. Ultimately, he sees us trapped in this tension. We face global problems requiring cooperation, but we cling to local identities national, religious, which often prioritize parochial interests and hinder our ability to find global solutions. Humility about our own group's importance, he suggests, is essential for breaking that deadlock.
Let's turn now to another critical theme that underpins many of these issues, ignorance, and the inherent limits of human knowledge, both individual and collective. He makes a rather humbling observation early on. Individually, we know very little about the complex world we inhabit. We think we know a lot, but it's mostly an illusion.
Right. He calls this the knowledge illusion. The example he uses is vivid. Ask people if they understand how a common zipper works. Most will confidently say yes. But then ask them to describe the actual mechanism step by step, and they fail miserably. We mistake familiarity for understanding. More importantly, we rely heavily on the expertise of others for almost everything we use or interact with, from our phones to our food supply to our political system. We effectively treat the knowledge stored in other people's minds, or in systems, as if it were our own.
And this reliance on others, while necessary, leads to the pervasive power of groupthink, which we touched on earlier.
Exactly. Relying on the collective knowledge of the tribe worked well for Homo sapiens for millennia. Sharing knowledge is our superpower. But in the modern age, with mass media and now social media, it can lead to people locking themselves inside echo chambers of like-minded friends and self-confirming news feeds. Our existing beliefs get constantly reinforced, while contradictory evidence or alternative perspectives are filtered out or dismissed. This happens even for beliefs that might be somewhat arbitrary, like the differing views of conservatives and progressives on environmental regulation, which often seem more rooted in group identity than in a deep engagement with the scientific data itself. This communal ignorance, this groupthink amplified by algorithms, rather than just individual stupidity, is a huge problem for navigating complex realities.
And leaders aren't immune, even with all their resources.
No, Harari argues power can actually worsen the problem. He talks about the black hole of power. Leaders, despite having access to vast resources and intelligence briefings, often struggle to find the real truth. Why? Partly because they are incredibly busy, forced to make decisions constantly, leaving little time for deep reflection or exploration. Action often trumps insight, and partly because power itself distorts the truth. Advisors and courtiers tend to tell leaders what they think they want to hear, or filter information to fit existing agendas or protect their own positions. Dissent is risky. As a result, he suggests truly revolutionary ideas or uncomfortable truths often emerge from the periphery, from outsiders who aren't constrained by the pressures of power.
This connects to another point about how we process complex information, or fail to, the preference for stories over statistics.
Yes, this is a crucial psychological insight he highlights. When confronted with complex, large-scale problems like global poverty or climate change, people often find statistics and abstract data overwhelming or emotionally distant. We naturally gravitate towards touching human stories. He shares a powerful experimental example. People were far more willing to donate money to help a single, named poor girl from Mali, Rokia, whose story they heard, than they were to donate to help a statistically representative group of 8 anonymous sick children, or even when dry statistics about broader African poverty were added to Rokia's story. The individual story engaged empathy in a way the numbers didn't.
That makes sense intuitively.
It does, but Harari warns this preference for simplified, emotionally resonant narratives can be dangerous. It can generate a kind of false moral certainty based on feeling good about helping one person while ignoring the larger systemic issues. It can even reduce our willingness to tackle the broader, more abstract problems that require systemic solutions, not just individual charity. All this boils down, he argues, to a critical absence in our current world. There's effectively no global community for truth. We face increasingly global problems, but we lack a trusted, collective entity or process to make sense of them together. Our existing tribes, nations, religions, political factions are primarily absorbed in advancing their own particular interests and narratives. This makes their interpretation of reality inherently partial, potentially biased, and ultimately untrustworthy for solving shared global challenges. We don't have a referee we all trust.
This leads directly into the whole post-truth discussion. Are we living in a new era of lies and fake news? Harari challenges this very notion, doesn't he?
He does, very provocatively. He challenges the idea that post-truth is some radical new phenomenon of the internet age. Instead, he argues, brace yourself, that humans have always lived in the age of post-truth. Homo sapiens, he asserts, is fundamentally a post-truth species whose power depends on creating and believing fictions. This is central to his work.
Okay, explain that. Fictions, how does that relate to truth?
Well, large-scale human cooperation, the thing that makes us dominant, depends on shared belief in things that don't physically exist. Gods, nations, money, corporations, human rights. These are all, in his terms, fictions or social constructs, stories we tell ourselves and collectively agree to treat as real. Think about Stone Age myths holding a tribe together, or modern religions uniting billions, or the shared belief in the value of a dollar bill. These powerful fictions enable cooperation on a massive scale. So he says, some fake news lasts forever. We've always relied on stories, on myths, on shared fictions to organize society. The current panic about fake news while addressing real problems with misinformation perhaps overlooks this much longer history of fiction shaping reality.
But he's not saying all fictions are bad or that religion is just fake news.
No, he's careful to clarify that. Equating religion or national myths with fake news isn't meant to deny their immense effectiveness or potential benevolence. Fictions are, for better or worse, among humanity's most effective tools. These shared stories inspire people to build hospitals, schools, and bridges, not just armies or walls. He uses the example of Chartres Cathedral. It's breathtakingly beautiful and represents immense collective effort, even if the biblical stories depicted in its stained glass, like Adam and Eve, are fictional from a historical perspective. However, he quickly adds, not all fictions, not all religious or national myths are beneficent. Some are deeply harmful. He cites the horrifying medieval Hugh of Lincoln blood libel, the false accusation that Jews ritually murdered Christian children, which fueled centuries of persecution, pogroms, and eventually the expulsion of Jews from England. Fictions can be incredibly dangerous, too.
So fictions are powerful for good or ill, and modern propaganda understands this.
Absolutely. He notes that modern propaganda masters, like Goebbels under Hitler, understood the power of repetition. Repeat a few points over and over again, simplify the message, appeal to emotion, and eventually a lie, told often enough, becomes the truth in the public mind. This isn't new to the internet, it's an old technique.
What about science fiction? He brings that in, too.
Yeah, he argues that science fiction has become arguably the most important artistic genre today because it's shaping how the public understands or misunderstands huge technological, social, and economic developments like AI, bioengineering, and climate change. But he argues it needs to be far more responsible in how it depicts scientific realities. While shows like The Matrix, Westworld, or Black Mirror raise critical questions, they often rely on certain tropes that might mislead us.
Like the idea of an authentic self?
Exactly. Many sci-fi narratives, from The Matrix escaping the simulation to Westworld's hosts finding consciousness, rely on this foundational myth. The idea that there's an authentic self deep inside, or a true real world outside the illusion that we can escape to or uncover. Harari, leaning on neuroscience and philosophy, argues forcefully that authenticity is a myth. There is no single, unchanging, essential self to discover. We are always trapped inside a box, our own brain, with its biochemical processes and conditioning, and that box is locked within a bigger box, human society, with its myriad fictions and cultural constructs. Escaping the matrix, he suggests provocatively, only reveals a bigger matrix. The peasants who revolted against the Tsar's oppressive system didn't find utopia. They ended up with Stalin's even more oppressive system. Similarly, deep self-exploration doesn't reveal a simple core self. It often reveals the complex, contradictory, and constructed nature of our identity, shaped by neural networks and external influences.
But this doesn't mean nothing is real, right? He makes a distinction.
Crucially, yes. He distinguishes that while the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves might be fictional, our experiences of pain, fear, joy, and love are undeniably real, even if they occur within a constructed reality or matrix. The fear you feel when watching a scary movie is biochemically real, even if the monster isn't. Our minds, he emphasizes, are deeply shaped by history and biology. We don't just freely shape them out of nothing. We're not simply free agents creating our reality. We are products of incredibly complex biological and historical processes.
He even praises a Disney movie for reflecting this.
He does. He singles out Disney Pixar's Inside Out for praise, saying it brutally dismantles the traditional Disney myth of an authentic self, making free choices to find happiness. Instead, Inside Out depicts the protagonist, Riley, almost like a huge robot managed by a collection of conflicting biochemical mechanisms, personified as joy, sadness, anger, fear, disgust. Her well-being comes not from finding one true self, but from the complex interaction and eventual acceptance of all these conflicting parts. There's no single driver at the wheel. This resonates, he suggests, with older wisdom, even Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Remember the savage, who rejects the perfectly comfortable but meaningless utopia. He famously claims the right to be unhappy, choosing pain, freedom, sin, and danger over engineered bliss. He chooses the complexity of real experience over a simplified, controlled existence. Harari brings this full circle by suggesting that learning to navigate this inner complexity, learning to see beyond the illusion of a simple unified self, escaping the narrow definition of self, might well become a necessary survival skill in the 21st century. We need to understand our own constructed nature to avoid being easily manipulated.
Okay, so given all this bewildering change, this questioning of self and truth, what on earth do we teach our children? How do we prepare them? Harari directly addresses education for an unpredictable future, acknowledging a profound challenge, the sheer unpredictability of it all.
Yeah, he says bluntly, we have no idea how the world will look in 2050. We don't know what jobs will exist, how societies will function, or even what the human body itself will be like, thanks to bioengineering potentially altering our physical and cognitive abilities. Therefore, much of what children learn today in terms of specific information or technical skills will likely be irrelevant in a few decades. Facts become outdated, skills become automated.
So cramming kids full of information, the old model, is useless. What's the alternative?
Pretty much useless, yeah. The old education systems focused on information recall, on drilling facts. The new reality demands something entirely different. Harari states that to survive and flourish in the mid-21st century and beyond, you will need, above all, a lot of mental flexibility and great reserves of emotional balance. The ability to constantly learn new things, yes, but perhaps more importantly, the ability to repeatedly let go of some of what you know best, to unlearn and to feel at home with the unknown, that will be paramount. Dealing with constant change and uncertainty without falling apart.
That sounds hard to teach.
Incredibly hard. And he warns this kind of resilience, this emotional balance, this adaptability, you cannot easily learn it from a book or lecture. And ironically, many teachers today, being products of the old industrial era education system themselves, may lack this new flexibility. How do you teach something you haven't mastered? It requires a fundamental paradigm shift for education globally.
This leads us right to Harari's ultimate exploration in the book, the quest for meaning, and his radical, perhaps challenging idea that ultimately life is not a story. Humans, he argues, seem fundamentally wired as storytelling animals. We constantly seek narratives, coherent stories, to explain reality, to understand our place in the cosmos, and to find the meaning of life. We crave stories with heroes, villains, conflicts, and hopefully happy endings.
Yes, we're pattern seekers and narrative builders. He provides several powerful examples of these grand cosmic stories that give life meaning. Disney's The Lion King, he points out, effectively repackaged the ancient pre-modern idea of fulfilling one's predetermined vocation within the hierarchical circle of life. Everyone has their place and duty. Communism offered a sweeping historical story, the inevitable history of class struggles, leading inexorably towards a proletariat victory and a future communist paradise. Nationalism provides powerful stories to Jerusalem as the eternal capital, the sacred duty to sacrifice for the nation. He shares a personal anecdote about attending Memorial Day ceremonies in Israel as a youth, feeling the immense power of the national story, but later recognizing the delusion of eternal national life. Nations rise and fall. Even the widespread belief in a personal legacy, or in reincarnation, the idea that one's individual story somehow continues beyond death, is a powerful narrative that shapes how people live. Though, he wryly notes, the two great religions embracing reincarnation, Hinduism and Buddhism, paradoxically see this endless cycle of stories as a cycle of futility and suffering, something to escape from, not perpetuate. Their goal is to get off the story go-round. And even romance offers a kind of story, reducing the vast and different universe to the beloved, finding infinite meaning in the intense connection of the here and now.
These stories give structure and meaning. But what happens when we doubt them? That seems terrifying.
It is. Harari emphasizes that it's extremely frightening to doubt the story, whichever one you live by, because our personal identity, who am I, and our collective institutions, nations, religions, companies, are literally built upon these shared narratives. Questioning the foundational story can feel like triggering a personal and social cataclysm. Everything could fall apart. He makes the fascinating point that sometimes the roof is sometimes more important than the foundations. The shared belief, the functioning structure, matters more than the logical or historical accuracy of the original story. He cites the arcane Filioque schism that divided Western and Eastern Christianity for 1,000 years, a split based on the theological interpretation of a single Latin word concerning the Holy Spirit. From the outside, it seems obscure, yet it defined identities and fueled conflict for centuries. The story, once established, took on a life of its own.
How do these stories become so real to us? He talks about rituals.
Yes, rituals are key to making fictions feel real. Priests, shamans, politicians, advertisers, they all discovered the power of rituals. These are often seemingly arbitrary magical acts that make the abstract concrete and the fictional tangible. Think about lighting candles in a church, wearing specific headgear, bowing towards Mecca, saluting a flag, eating specific foods on holidays, like Easter eggs symbolizing rebirth or the bitter herbs at Passover recalling slavery. These actions embody the story, make it physically manifest. It's not just an idea, it's something you do.
And the most potent ritual of all, sacrifice.
Sacrifice, Harari argues, is the ultimate ritual for making stories real. Why? Of all rituals, sacrifice is the most potent because of all the things in the world, suffering is the most real. Pain is undeniable. If you suffer for a story, if you fast for God, if you lose your legs fighting for your country, if you endure hardship for a cause, or even if you just pay a huge amount of money for something like an uncomfortable designer dress or a gas-guzzling Ferrari, that suffering usually convinces you psychologically that the story must be real and important. Why else would you endure the pain or cost? This is the mysterious alchemy of sacrifice. It creates commitment through sunk costs, essentially. The more we sacrifice for a belief, the stronger our faith in it becomes, even if it's logically a fallacy. I suffered for it, therefore it must be true.
Okay, so stories, rituals, sacrifice. They build meaning. What about the modern liberal story of meaning? How does that fit in?
The liberal story, in contrast to older, more rigid narratives, generally encourages individuals to create their own meaning through free choices and by listening to their authentic feelings. Follow your heart, find your passion, express yourself. The ultimate liberal ideals are often centered around creativity, discovery, and fighting for liberty. Think of heroes like Rosa Parks, Picasso, Marie Curie, Pasteur, people who forged their own paths and changed the world through individual action and conviction. But Harari finds a flaw here too, in the idea of free will. Yes, he returns to his critique of free will. He argues that liberalism operates with a fundamentally confused notion of free will. We might have the freedom to do what you desire, to act on our impulses and choices. But, he argues, drawing again on biology and neuroscience, we do not have the freedom to choose what to desire in the first place. Our desires themselves, what we want, what we feel, what we value, are largely the products of complex biochemical and cultural processes happening inside us, processes that are mostly beyond our conscious control or understanding. We don't choose to want chocolate or to fall in love. It largely happens to us.
Which leads him to question the self that is supposedly making these free choices.
Exactly. This leads to one of his most profound and perhaps unsettling insights. The self, the narrator in our head, the feeling of a stable I making decisions, is itself a constantly manufactured fictional story. Our brain's inner narrator spins this story to make sense of the stream of consciousness, patching together memories, sensations, and thoughts into a coherent, or mostly coherent, narrative identity. It's much like the carefully curated profiles we create on Facebook or Instagram, simplified, edited versions of reality that we eventually start mistaking for the whole truth. Harari's radical conclusion from this line of thought is, you are not a story. The feeling of being a continuous self, progressing through a life story, is a powerful illusion, a useful one perhaps, but an illusion nonetheless.
Oh, that's a big one to absorb.
It is. And it echoes ancient wisdom, particularly the Buddha's three basic realities of existence he often refers to. 1. Everything constantly changes. Impermanence. 2. Nothing has a fixed, enduring essence or soul. No self. 3. Nothing is ever completely satisfying. Suffering dissatisfaction. He argues that much of our suffering arises precisely from our attachment to illusory eternal essences. Belief in an eternal God, an undying nation, an immortal soul, a fixed true self, or even perfect, unchanging true love. We grasp for permanence in an impermanent world, and this attachment often leads to disappointment, craving, and even hatred towards anything or anyone perceived as blocking our path to that illusory eternal goal.
So if stories and even the self are fictions, how do we distinguish what's real? It's the anchor. He comes back to suffering.
Yes, suffering becomes the crucial litmus test. To distinguish fiction from reality, Harari suggests the place to start is with suffering. Pain is real, fear is real, despair is real, joy is real. These experiences are undeniable, regardless of the stories we tell about them. He urges us to be wary of political or religious rhetoric that uses grand, abstract, mystical terms like sacrifice, eternity, purity, redemption. These words often obscure concrete suffering. He advises translating such potential hogwash into real terms of human or animal experience. What does this national sacrifice actually mean? It means a soldier crying in agony, a woman beaten and brutalized, a child shaking in fear. Focus on the concrete experience of suffering beings, he implies, and you'll cut through a lot of manipulative fiction. Nations and corporations cannot suffer, only sentient individuals can.
And this connects to his personal practice of Vipassana meditation.
It does. He concludes the book by discussing his own experience with Vipassana meditation, not as a religious dogma, but as a practical method for observing reality directly. He describes it as a technique to systematically and non-reactively observe the body sensations that constantly arise and pass away, and which underpin our emotional reactions, feeling the actual physical burning sensation of anger, for instance, rather than getting lost in the angry story. Through this direct observation, he says he came to realize personally that the deepest source of my suffering is in the patterns of my own mind, my cravings, my aversions, my tendency to get caught up in stories. He presents it not as the only answer, but as a tool for direct experiential observation of reality as it is, without relying solely on secondhand stories, theories, or ideologies. It's a path towards understanding the nature of suffering in the mind directly.
We've certainly traversed a vast and challenging landscape of ideas today, from the AI revolution threatening jobs and our sense of autonomy to the illusions of grand civilizational clashes and the surprising fundamental power of fictional stories that shape our societies and even our sense of self. Harari's 21 Lessons for the 21st Century really forces you, to confront some of our deepest assumptions about progress, about identity, about the very nature of reality. He presents a stark challenge, doesn't he? If we are, as he argues, a species that thrives on fiction, how do we possibly discern truth in a world increasingly awash with sophisticated manufactured narratives? And if our very self is merely a story our mind constantly manufactures, what does it truly mean to know thyself in this complex 21st century?
It's a profound question. And the answer he seems to suggest, echoing ancient wisdom, may lie not in finding a newer, better story to believe in, but perhaps in cultivating the ability to observe reality directly, as it is, moment by moment. Starting maybe with the most undeniable reality of all, the reality of suffering, our own and others.
What stands out most to you from this deep dive into Harari's lessons? And how might these insights, these challenging ideas, change the way you think about and navigate the bewildering world of tomorrow? We hope this deep dive has given you some valuable clarity, or at least some crucial questions to ponder.